So first of all, thank you for coming to the Southwest by Southwest Corners annual meeting. So just an outline of what today is going to look like. We're going to start with some updates on what the SWMLC's been up to, what we've been doing, changes that have happened. Then we're going to break out into some smaller discussion rooms. We're going to talk about how invasive species impact you and your community. And then to wrap it off, we have Mitch Leto from the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy, who's going to come talk to us about stories from the Understory, restorations learned from our plant partners. All right. So to get started, so who is the SWMLC is a great question. You could definitely say that the SWMLC is everyone in Van Buren, Cass, and Berrien counties. But the people doing a huge amount of the work is, we have two full-time employees for the SWMLC, which is myself, the coordinator. So I do most of our outreach and education activities, as well as Abby Bristol, who you'll hear more from later, our strike team coordinator. She does more of our like on the ground management activities. We also have our steering committee, who does a lot of work to set the direction and set the priorities for the SWMLC. And that's made up of the directors from our 3 conservation districts. So that's Nancy, Corey, and Kim, as well as 2 representatives from 2 of the land conservancies in our SWMLC, Dan and Dave, as well as Vic from the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. Click that. We've had some updates, some turnover in our team in the last year. Some of you may have met Nor Saraki in the past. She was our coordinator from 2016 till last year. Abby, can you manage admitting everyone in the participant window? Thank you.
I got you.
So Nor left the SWMLC in 2021 to go to Michigan Tech to pursue a master's degree. She loves the cold so much that she's spending her summers up in Alaska studying bogs instead of in cold Houghton. There's also myself. I started right as Nor was leaving. I have a bachelor's degree in biology from Grand Valley. After that, I studied invasive fish, kind of around the Midwest, and then later became the hemlock woolly adelgid survey tech for the SWMLC, and they decided I did a good job and kept me on. We also added Vic on as another member of our steering committee back in November. We're also hiring right now. So if more likely someone you know is interested in working with us on all the amazing projects we're about to talk about, feel free to connect with us. Our emails will be at the end. You should have my email address. We are looking to hire 2 people for our strike team. Now I'm going to turn it over to Abby, our strike team coordinator, to talk about a lot of the projects that we've been doing.
Yeah, hi guys. You all can hear me, I'm assuming. Let me know if you can't hear me. So again, my name is Abby Bristol, and I am the strike team coordinator for Southwest by Southwest Corner CISMA. This first project that I'm going to talk about from 2021 really comes full circle for both myself as well as Alex. As he mentioned, he was the HWA tech last year, and when I started in 2019, this is what I came on as well. So this is kind of a gateway drug to getting into the SWMLC. So what this project was surrounding the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is a teeny tiny insect that sucks the sap from hemlock trees. It's decimated hemlock populations on the east side of the country, and has since 2016 was found in Michigan. So the the surveys that we conducted last year were a continuation of 2 years prior surveys from 2 years prior. Last year we had the main goal of finding where the southernmost population of hemlock woolly adelgid is. So we worked with our partners of the West Michigan SWMLC in Allegan County, because Allegan County is in Fenville, is the southernmost known population of hemlock woolly adelgid. So we worked with them to try to figure out where that that southernmost population is. I'm happy to say that we did not find anything within our SWMLC, nor did we find anything south of the known population in Fenville. Go ahead and go to the next one. So another great project that was also funded by the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program, like the hemlock woolly adelgid, was our decontamination grant. We just finished this up, and this grant allowed us to install signs and boot brushes throughout trails and parks. Many of you may actually recognize these signs because many of you put them up at your trails and parks. We were able to offer these at no cost to our partners. One of the really exciting things that I liked about this project was we partnered with folks from Eagle as well as Play Clean Go to create a bilingual boot brush sign, and that's what you can see there in the center. But not only did this create signs that partners could use and install at their trails and parks, but this also funded surveys of invasive species at campgrounds and public boat launches, as well as educational events for anglers on proper decontamination procedures for their boats. Go on to the next one. So this was the first year for the strike team that I really started in the end of 2019 to get that going, or sorry, 2020 to get that going. And one of the big projects that we worked on in 2021 was managing high priority invasive species. One of those species is stilt grass. We have one known location in Michigan, and it spans across 3 private properties. And in this picture, what you're looking at is our strike team, Andrew and Dan, mapping little patches of stilt grass as we're walking to continue treatment. It's a really tricky species because it's so inconspicuous, it's so sneaky, and it does a great job of hiding in all of that foliage. So there's an established population on the east side of Michigan in Washtenaw County. So that's why it's really key for us to properly treat, map, and monitor these patches that we know of now. So it would be remiss of me if I didn't mention how to ID this inconspicuous little plant. So take a look at these photos. These are photos that I took at that site that I just mentioned. Notice the shiny white off-center line down the middle of the leaf. That's always what I look for when I'm looking for stilt grass, or if I'm trying to convince myself that it is stilt grass. But it is also a grass, and so it has parallel venation, which just means it has fine lines tracing from the base of the leaf to the tip of the leaf. It can reach about 3 feet tall once it's fully grown at the end of the season, about the end of the summer. It's an annual, so at the end of the summer, it'll dry up and fall over and create a dense, thicket of thatch that is a fire hazard as well as difficult for other species to grow through. So if you're finding this plant, you give me a call. This funding does allow us to treat this species for free for the property owner. Go ahead and go to the next one. Another species, in addition to the stilt grass covered under this grant, is kudzu, or the vine that ate the South. And it's called that because it did just that. That's part of the reason why it's so high priority in Michigan, is because we don't want to continue to see that destruction in our state. We have 5 known locations of it in Southwest Michigan. And where treatment has occurred, treatment has gone really well. It seems that kudzu doesn't seem to like our winters or how cold our winters can get. However, some locations of the kudzu have proven difficult to access, mostly because it's private property that has changed ownership in the last year or two. This particular picture, or you can go back, this particular picture that you're looking at is at a South Haven patch that is on public property. In the last couple of years, either the SISMA or the South Haven staff has treated it. And take a look at its draping characteristic. It is a vine, and it's a vine that, as it creeps along the ground, can re-root back into the ground, making it especially difficult to pull up. If you were to pull it up and any of those re-rooted roots, the crowns, stay in the ground, then it will just regrow. Go on, go to the next one. If you look a little bit closer at those leaves, it kind of looks like poison ivy with those leaves of 3 and with it being a vine. But kudzu, the leaves are a little bit bigger than poison ivy and they are really fuzzy. So if you can see that stem, notice how fuzzy that stem is, and it feels quite soft when you touch it. Those stems are also studded with little purple spots. And as the stem gets larger, it becomes more purple and eventually turns into a woody vine with a gray, smooth bark. Next slide. It's a really beautiful plant. It is in the bean family, Fabaceae, and so it has these sweet pea-like flowers that start blooming at the base of this cone-shaped flower head and continue blooming upwards as the season goes on. And again, you can see how fuzzy those stems are. And just like stilt grass, if you think you see this, please let me know, because I want to be able to get the treatment started and make sure that we're not going to end up like the situation down in Georgia. Next slide. So another species that we targeted in 2021 was Japanese knotweed. We had a grant from the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program to work with property owners to treat the Japanese knotweed on their property. And one of the, as you can see on the left picture, is Andrew treating at somebody's property a big patch of Japanese knotweed. We learned a lot with this plant, with this grant. Primarily for me was just talking to people about Japanese knotweed. I always tell people that this is a beast of a plant, and I cannot understate how persistent it is. Just to give you an idea, Japanese knotweed has evolved to be the first thing that comes up after a volcanic eruption. And this means that when hot lava flows over the plant can survive. The lava will cool over the plant, and then the roots of that plant can still send up shoots through that rock. So it's really a hardy species. It does really well with fragmentation, and so if any part of it, something even as small as the size of a pea, fragment of the plant, can start its own plant afterwards, its own organism if it's been moved. And that's why I especially like this picture on the right. I took this picture after monitoring a private property. The gentleman had put these little orange stakes into the ground where he was into his lawn where he was finding Japanese knotweed, and that was a little reminder to him to not mow it. And I thought that was a really ingenious way to keep himself from moving it around through that fragmentation. Next slide. With this grant, we also found some really weird stuff. This was found when I showed up for treatment for Japanese knotweed at somebody's property. A few weeks prior, we had done a survey and everything looked good. And then when I came for treatment, I found what looked to be a dead body. So naturally, I went to investigate that, and you can go to the next slide. You can see that looking into it, those asparagus looking stems is Japanese knotweed, and it was starting to reroot and sprout vigorously from those roots that had been severed and taken out of the ground. On the right picture there, you can see that the that you can, in this, just in the center, you see the dirt that was dug out, that was disturbed. And when I had been there a few weeks prior to do the survey, it looked fine. It was just one plant. It was going to be easy as it gets for Japanese knotweed to manage. But for whatever reason, I didn't convey well enough to the property owner that it shouldn't be touched. So he tried to dig it out. And it makes sense if you have just one plant, you know, maybe it's, if I dig deep enough, I can get the roots. But the roots of this plant are very extensive and they can move very far laterally away from the plant. And so what you're looking at there is, although the one individual plant that was seen above ground is gone, now you have this vigorous resprouting of new plants, new foliage, and that's what all of those little shield shape leaves are. Not to mention a disposal issue being the stems and the roots that are within that tarp. So I include this as a cautionary tale in terms of what can happen when knotweed is disturbed and when it's improperly managed, and how quickly that population can get out of hand. The last projects that I'm going to talk about was our a grant that we got from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. I wrote this grant in 2020 to really just to get the strike team, the first year of the strike team, to hit the ground running. The idea of this grant was to partner with local land conservancies to increase their capacity to work at wetland, at their wetland properties, so that they that may not have gotten attention in 2021. But really, it was an excuse for me to work with these land conservancies and get to know them and get to know these really awesome properties and get to know these really awesome habitats and have some definite management opportunities for the strike team. So I just want to shout out those conservancies that we're working with for this grant. It's Chickiming Open Lands, Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy, the Nature Conservancy, and Michigan Nature Association. If you haven't heard of any of them, definitely go check them out. You probably have if you're here, but they're really great people and really great really great to work with. We finished up management for last year in about October, and then we're going to continue management this year. And I'm hoping we can find funding to create to kind of continue that management onward. I'm going to pass it back to Alex, and he's going to talk to you about a couple more projects that we had.
Yep. So we also had the opportunity to work with Eagle on some parrot feather that is growing in only a handful of places across the state and only one site here in our SWMLC. So parrot feather is a milfoil, kind of similar to Eurasian water milfoil, except it sticks up a little bit out of the water, which you can see at the top there. And Eagle is the ones actually coming out doing the treatment, doing the spraying for this. But we just go out every month to check these sites, see how extensive it is, how well the treatment's working, and that really helps inform Eagle's work actually doing that. We also partnered with the Van Buren County Road Commission this year to spray Japanese knotweed and Phragmites just in the right-of-way of the road. And that was a really cool project. Let us see kind of that whole county. Yeah. Let's see. Yep. We also do a lot of outreach events, which are very important. You know, we can manage as much as we want, but really getting volunteers and getting the public engaged is how we multiply our effort as much as possible. So for invasive species that are already in the SWMLC, that's really helpful because we can do events like our Paddle with a Naturalist, where we talk about what we're seeing, what different invasives there are, and then we teach people how to decontaminate their boats, usually with bleach water, so that they're not spreading those invasives around to other lakes. We can also do events to teach people about invasives that aren't here yet, but are on their way, so that hopefully more people are aware of it. We can detect it earlier, have a better chance of stopping it. Yep. Cool. And looking ahead to 2022, we've got a lot of cool projects coming up. We're doing our second season of the strike team, continuing a lot of stuff we talked about already. We're going to be starting surveys for spotted lanternfly, which is an invasive insect that's been doing a lot of damage in like Pennsylvania, and it's sort of spread into Ohio a little bit. So we're starting some surveys, partnering with MDARD to just make sure that we see it when it gets here or if it gets here. We're also expanding our Japanese knotweed injector rental. All three of the conservation districts in the SWMLC have a Japanese knotweed injector, which is just, it's like a little needle with a thing, with a tub of herbicide on it that you can inject into the stems and just put a little bit of herbicide in that really is effective at killing plants. It's time consuming if there's more than say 100 stems, but for smaller patches, for individual landowners, it's a really good option. So we're going to be expanding to do some trainings to hopefully get more people aware of those and using them. We're also working on revising our strategic plan. So the strategic plan, along with the steering committee, sorry, are what sets our priorities and sets us, on the right path. So as we're revising our strategic plan that was first written in 2016 when the SWMLC formed, we're really trying to hear from people what they see as the issues with invasive species. So in a little bit, we are going to be doing some breakout rooms, and that's really what we're trying to get is more input from other people besides just us who are thinking about invasive species constantly on how invasive species impact them. Yep. Thank you. Now we're going to open it up to questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand. We did get one question already, which is going to be for Abby. This is from Dan. Are we working or communicating with the Stilt Grass working group in Washtenaw County?
Yeah, good question. I actually somehow didn't know about that until a few months ago when I came across it on the Stewardship Network's website. And actually just in this last week, now that I'm starting to schedule management for 2022, found a TSN webcast, an old TSN webcast from 2019, talking about the management and the outreach that happened surrounding the Stilt Grass in Washtenaw County, and just reached out to those folks. And I'm looking forward to picking their brain and getting to know more about getting an update from what's going on there. So thanks to the Stewardship Network for that connection.
Good. I'm glad you reached out. If you hadn't, I can put you in touch, or if they don't get back with you or whatever, I can.
Is that like?
So
do you know? Is it Becky and who's the other? Carlisle.
Becky Gajewski, and there's Katie Carlisle, and I think Mike Hahn.
Okay.
There might be somebody else that whose name escapes me, but yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
I'm going to be setting up the breakout room, so Abby, if you could manage the questions, that would be great.
Yeah, no problem. Let's see. Another question: is parrot feather used in ornamental ponds? Yes, that is a really good point. And that is where it has been found. In Berrien County is just two ornamental ponds that have, and the third pond is a natural pond that has been just kind of caught in the crossfire. Let's see, looking for other questions. Oh, Wayne, you're here. Cool. So Wayne says that he has had success the last 2 years on small patches of defoliating Japanese knotweed, where he pulls off the leaves from the plant. The plant doesn't grow well, and he's been doing this for every 2 to 4 weeks through the summer. I had the pleasure of working with Wayne a few months ago, and he told me about this method that he's been doing with Japanese knotweed, and I think it's really exciting. I can't wait to hear more about that, Wayne. So definitely keep me updated. What townships have knotweed? Ooh, I wouldn't be able to tell you the townships. In as far as Van Buren goes, every township has it, mostly to differing levels. I think the only township that doesn't have it, if I remember correctly, is Hamilton in Van Buren. As far as Berrien and Cass counties, they both definitely have it. Again, I couldn't tell you which townships, however. If you're curious if it's near you, however, you can go to missin.msu.edu, I believe. And that provides maps for where Japanese knotweed has been mapped.
Which is not the same as where it's located.
Which isn't always the same as where it's been located, right? But if you think you've found some, definitely take a picture and feel free, thanks Mitch, and feel free to send that to Invasives Management. That one of the emails here will get that picture and we can tell you if we think it's Japanese knotweed or not. And then I encourage you to go to Missin, make an account and report the invasive species that you're seeing, and that helps management as we go on. Cool. How are breakout rooms coming?
Breakout rooms are ready to go, and
Cool.
in the interest of time, I think we need to move into them.
Okay. I want to just real quick read Heidi Fry's question. Can you describe any targeting activities that you do? Are you able to reach out to private property owners that have high quality systems? That's a really good question, Heidi Fry. And I am, it's something that we're trying to figure out. I think one of the big things that we can do is try to target easements, like working with an organization like SWMLC and trying to figure out how we can work with their known easements, as well as working in a corridor that I believe SWMLC has developed or mapped throughout the CISMA area, so that we can work within those high quality areas and help connect them. It's a great question. All right, we can move on.
All right. If you have any more questions, feel free to send us an email. Our contact info is on the screen right now, and you should have my email from the invite. So now we're going to move out to breakout room discussions. We really just want to hear how invasive species impact you in your community. So we've set it up so each breakout room has a moderator who's been generous enough to volunteer to help us with this. The breakout sessions will not be recorded, but we will afterwards have a short session on just to hear some summaries from each group on what they talked about. If you aren't from our 3-county service area, we do still want to hear your input. I know there's a couple people from outside who are here. Everyone should be back in the main call now. So sorry if that seemed a little short, but want to make sure that we had enough time for everything we wanted to get through today. So now let's hear some summaries. Like, what did you guys talk about? Let's start with Jacob's group, room 1.
Yeah, so I think we had a really good mix of both aquatic and terrestrial invasive species. We had Kim, who lives on Reynolds Lake, and then Paul, who lives on Eagle Lake and Cass. They talked about their concerns with both fish and plant exotics, Asian carp, Eurasian milfoil, zebra mussels, starry stonewort. And then we also had Corey and Carrie talked about their terrestrial and invasive species. Corey discussed about the tree of heaven near her home and her attempts and treatment with that. And then Corey talked about being on the lookout for out of olive, multifloral rose, and also Japanese knotweed.
So you're concerned about every invasive that kind of sounds.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. Abby from room 2.
Yeah, so our group had a great mix of conservation, like Conservancy folks and state folks, volunteers, really active volunteers, students, and municipality organizations and entities. So it was a really well-rounded group. And we talked about things like invasive species are everywhere. They're everywhere, and it's once you see them, you don't really unsee them. In the urban areas that you're encountering most likely have invasive species throughout. Unless you're going to a really high quality area that's a park or protected under an easement or private property, you're most likely going to be surrounded by invasive species. So it's difficult to say how it impacts you because it's almost omnipresent. And so if that's the case, then do we want to have some kind of tolerance for invasive species in certain in urban areas or other specific areas? And how do we, since our resources and funding is limited in a lot of ways, how do we protect the areas that are most meaningful, and how do we define those areas as meaningful? And it doesn't have to just be public property, but private property, and getting involved with different communities, especially communities that wouldn't know how to find a SISMA or how to find and connect with a land conservancy. So how could this be more equitable? One of the things that we kind of ended up on was the last thing that I was going to mention was that we could have a whole conference just on how to try to get that more equitable management. So it was a really great conversation. Thanks everybody for chatting.
Awesome. Room 3, Dan.
Yeah, so similar to Abby's group, and probably by design, we had a nice mix of people. We had road commission and a private contractor, stewardship network, DNR, myself at a land conservancy. So we kind of had a nice breadth of experience, as well as a large suite of invasives. Some of a couple people in our group are working beyond this tri-county area, which is kind of gave a different perspective. Few invasives that just kind of stood out in conversation. Knotweed was definitely mentioned, and it's located in plenty of locations. One of our visitors said that they had it in their yard, and fortunately their landlord was willing to help treat it, which is a church. So it's nice to see a non-conservation group willing to dive in. Purple loosestrife was mentioned. Oddly enough, 2 of our members actually live really close to each other, just randomly. So they had the same purple loosestrife patch they were concerned about. And one that, I mean, our land conservancy is dealing with all the various invasives, although pleasantly we don't have huge numbers of them like I've seen elsewhere. But one particularly problematic one, or just difficult one, is that we're dealing with is oak wilt in our area. Hard to figure out exactly how to do that one best. And it can be both ecologically and safety wise a hazard. So yeah. Those are the highlights from ours.
Room 4, Dave.
Yeah. Again, great job putting the rooms together. We had a good mix of people, Alex. So one good point brought up was agriculture issues with obviously spotted lanternfly is the big one coming in right now, and kind of the economic impact that farmers are potentially having, going to have, etc. And talking about farm-oriented early detection and rapid response, and what's coming next as well. A lot of farmers are really looking at, like, all right, what do we need to worry about next? We're already worrying about spotted lanternfly. What's coming next? County drains too. Next point was, managing. Randy said there's 560 drains in Van Buren County alone, so he's working on reaching out to other drain commissioners as points of spreading invasive species, which is really nice to hear of. governmental agencies looking at points of access for invasive species and spreading. There's a point made of targeting mailings and spreading patterns, like known locations of invasive species, high priority targets, which has been done to an extent in some SISMAs, but is always a good thing to reach out and do more outreach and whatnot. And then reducing the amount of invasive species on tribal lands and keeping it out of tribal lands based on the needs that they have for the plants that they're trying to encourage, and keeping them from crossing back across boundaries, which of note in our own experience, as well as fence lines and adjacent property owners who maybe haven't drank the punch as much as everyone in this room on invasive species, working across those boundary lines, blurring the edges a little bit, keeping the bittersweet off the fence row, sort of thing. And that's what comes to my mind. And then I said something non-ag, non-economic based, but safety concern is managing a public nature preserve, having invasive shrubs, causing visibility and security problems around parking areas, trail systems, etc. Whether it's for people doing things they shouldn't be doing in parking lots versus just people feeling safe out in nature as well, having sight lines, etc. Because not everyone's as comfortable in nature as some people might be as well. So those are the finer points, and I'm sure I've missed something, so I apologize. But yeah,
I've seen, I think it was the Federal Department of Transportation put out a document a couple months ago that included invasive species growing up in intersections and blocking views there and such. Yeah, cool. And
Phragmites especially.
Yep. And finally, room 5, Nancy.
Okay, so we had a really good discussion. A couple of landowners were in our group, and both Jennifer and Mark were concerned about Oriental bittersweet on their property and how it is affecting them and their property. So we talked a lot about that, and kind of concluded that due to the severity of the Oriental bittersweet, there is a reduction in the ability to enjoy their property. It costs them money to control it. It costs them their time to control it. And they also really touched on the fact that, neighbors have it, and it requires a coordinated effort, with adjoining landowners, really, to control not only Oriental bittersweet, but really any invasive species that, spreads greatly. Emily had a really good, had some really good thoughts and talked about how education is the key. Some of these neighboring landowners may not even, they're not even aware that they have a problem. So education is definitely the key there. And she also, reiterated that, early detection and control is the key to get a jump on these things.
Yeah. Yeah, early detection is definitely something we focus on. I think well over half the things we talked about at the beginning of the presentation was early detection species that we're working on. But good to hear. All right. Yep. So next, we're going to be moving on to our keynote speaker. Mitch Lettow is the Stewardship Director for the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy. I first heard this talk of his a couple months ago when he gave it for the Stewardship Network's kind of annual webcast. And side note, if you're not listening to the Stewardship Network's monthly webinars, they are definitely worth tuning into. Mitch, are you online?
I'm here. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, I can. So
All
I'm
right.
going to stop sharing my screen.
And how's that look, Alex?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for inviting me, and it's so good to see all these names, many of them familiar, but hearing about everybody from all these different walks of life dealing with invasives. And yeah, I'm also just happy to be involved with the CISMA. I really love the work that you all are doing. And before the CISMAs kind of were created, it felt like a lot of these issues were just going unaddressed, and we're kind of at the periphery of what our organization, the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy, could do. And it was really frustrating not to be able to kind of address them. And so it feels like it fits a really great niche in our community in terms of conservation. So just appreciate the work that all of you are doing, volunteers, CISMA staff, board, and everybody in between. So my name is Mitch Leto. I'm the Stewardship Director for the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy. There's also a couple of my partner in crime, Dave Brown, is here, who's another Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy staff member. I saw Randy Counterman on here, an early mentor, and Swimlick, as our moniker is, for better or for worse, alumnus. And I think I saw Christy Chapman on here too, who is a incredible volunteer that we've had for probably about 15 years now. So in any case, I'll go ahead and get started. And a couple of years ago, I started trying to collect some of the sort of success stories of what our restoration work had been doing, and trying to figure out kind of what the narrative was. And it was at that time I was reading a couple of books from Robin Wall Kimmerer. If any of you have not read Braiding Sweetgrass or Gathering Moss, they're fabulous books. And she has this great blend of traditional ecological knowledge from Potawatomi and other indigenous groups and sort of Western science. And she comes up with these lessons that she's learned from the plants themselves and from their perspective. So that's kind of, I'm totally using that template of hers. And so I'm calling it Stories from the Understory and Overstory, Lessons Learned from Our Plant Partners. And there'll be a few times in the presentation where I'll use the chat function. So I'll put up a picture of a plant and see if you can guess what it is from the perspective there. And then that will kind of be the iconic plant for that story, I guess. So with that, go ahead and get my slide advance going. So rough outline, I'll just talk a little bit about our organization, the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancies, and then we'll do 3 stories basically. So we'll start, like I mentioned, with a plant that represents this lesson. We'll kind of do like a Christopher Nolan movie thing where we start at the end with the plant and then we circle back to the beginning and figure out how that plant told us that story. And then the lesson that's associated with that, kind of philosophical and practical. And then we'll have some time for questions. And then if there are questions or anything in the chat, Alex, if you want to help me, if there's clarification that's needed before I move on, just shout it out. I'm happy to stop.
Yep.
All right, so first we'll just kind of get into the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy and our world and what we do. So the pink outline there is kind of my universe, as it were, our universe, and how the lines are drawn in Southwest Michigan for us. Kind of first and foremost, the first folks that were stewarding these lands were the Anishinaabe, in particular the Potawatomi, of which we have a few different bands in our service area. So I want to acknowledge those folks, both historically and doing the work today. It's 9 municipal counties in our service area. So the bottom left corner, of course, is that Southwest by Southwest, kind of the core of the Southwest part of the state. So love that name, of course. And it's about 3 million acres in total. It's over 3 million acres. So one way to think about it, I haven't really been to Connecticut, so maybe it's not super relevant. But anyways, the state of Connecticut is roughly the size of our service area. So it's a pretty good chunk of land when you think about it in that way. Challenging enough to kind of wrap your head around, but very interesting too. And over, since 1991, we're over the 30-year mark at this point. We've protected, which I'll explain in the next slide, 18,000 acres. And so you can see the various polygons that are scattered throughout the service area. And each of those represent either a private conservation easement that are protected but not open to the public, or the green are the public nature preserves that the Land Conservancy owns and manages with volunteers and are open to the public in some fashion. And of course, I always have to mention, a lot of folks think we get some kind of tax revenue through county or state or something like that, but we are a 501c3 nonprofit. So we rely on memberships and donations and volunteerism and blood, sweat, and tears like any nonprofit. So if I identified you in that, I would appreciate that in whatever form you might be supporting us in, but I wouldn't be able to have my job without it. So I really appreciate it. So now I'll kind of move into the nuts and bolts a little bit of the work that we do and how we conserve land. So when we say we conserve X number of acres, what does that actually mean? So there's two kind of main tools that we have. The first one are conservation easements. And these are tax-based incentives. These folks, often have great conservation ethic, but let's be honest, money helps. And so these conservation easements have been supported in a bipartisan fashion for years and years. So they're a really great tool to work with private landowners. And it limits development to a particular part of the property and working with the landowner, and often it's the landowner who initiates the conversation about wanting to protect their property indefinitely. It limits development to a particular portion of the property. And by doing that and doing that planning process, it helps protect the conservation values of the other parts of the property. Anything from active farmland to biodiversity, to water quality, to carbon storage, all those things that we think of as conservation values. And over the 30 or so years that we've been around, we have over 100 of these areas scattered throughout the 9 counties in Southwest Michigan, or about 14,000 acres. So then the other side of things, which, Dave and I, and probably most folks here will show our bias, because that's where the nature preserves, those are the places that our organization owns and we manage with this community of volunteers and members. And neighbors as well. So like I mentioned, in this case, we are the owner of the conservation easements. They're private landowners, so we don't manage those places or own them. They're places that are sometimes donated outright, sometimes sold at a discount or sold to us, and we pursue grant funds to purchase them. And many of them are open to the public. I think there's around 15 throughout our service area, and my talented coworker Amelia just revamped our preserve pages on our website. So SWMLC.org. You can go and look at all those places. A bunch of them are in Van Buren, Cass, and Berrien. So great places that you can go and visit. There are some places that are either very sensitive, or just as a small organization, we don't have the capacity to be managing trails and parking lots and things like that in all of these places. And there's over 50 of these individual locations, ranging in size from 3 acres to 300, and total is about 4,000. So that's kind of what that 18,000 number means in a nuts and bolts fashion. And then the last thing I'll say about our organization, and Christy's thinking she could sneak into the Zoom here without getting identified in a slide, but from the beginning, basically, stewardship and restoration has been baked into the fabric of what we do. I think in some places, there's a sort of wilderness model of, here's where the wild places are, and people are sort of separate from it, or they're, visitors. And I think in the sort of more fragmented landscape of Southwest Michigan, where we have, a large, human community here, and we have natural areas that we're talking about invasive species, they really need our help. And frankly, with all the technology and things going on in our world, people need nature too. And so it's just this great marriage of people getting out and taking care of the land and looking after the land and those people, you know, reaping those benefits of being outside and doing the work. And so when I think of conservation, I think of both of these. So there's the sort of when the ink dries on the paperwork and working with landowners and doing all that, that's a really critical step, obviously, to the land protection. But in some ways, that's when the work really starts. After the ink dries, then we can go to work taking care of these places. And there's a great set of snapshots here of just different projects that we've done. Everything from trails and erosion. There's a monarch way station there in the lower left. We pull a lot of garlic mustard and do that kind of work, picking up trash and just having a good time while we're at it. So, all right, so with that, I'm gonna start our first story here, and anybody feel free to just fire away in the chat what they think that the plant in this image is. Yeah, Christy Chapman is an icon. Thanks, Randy. She is like the poster child. Swan milkweed, good guess. That is like the second most common. Yep. So Abby got it. This is Joe Pyeweed. Swamp milkweed has almost that exact same tone and kind of shape of its head, but this is, switch over to my slides here. This is Eutrophia Immaculatum. Joe Pyeweed, they changed the name a couple of years ago in case you were tripped up by that. But that is the common name. And I also call it pollinator buffet sometimes because just searching for Google images for this plant, you can't really find one without some kind of insect on it. So you can see in the upper left, there's actually a little sweat bee on there. There's a little larva, maybe a butterfly or something here. And then there's obviously the big fritillary butterfly right in the middle. So great native plant. And that'll be kind of the poster child for our first story. So this story takes place at a preserve called Bow in the Clouds. So this is the kind of general map of the property. The black outline is the boundary itself. And there's a green line that's pretty faint that goes up that road on the east boundary and cuts over the top. And actually it's 60 acres within the city limits of Kalamazoo. So pretty cool that our largest essentially metropolitan population in our service area has access to a natural area. So that's definitely not the rule as far as our preserves go. They're often in more rural settings. So great opportunity, like I said, for nature and for people. This was donated to us by the Sisters of St. Joseph. And if you're not familiar with Kalamazoo and its kind of history, the sisters have been here for a while now. Since the late 1800s, they had a charter to come here and establish a hospital, and they established Borges Hospital, and then later had an orphanage and in addition to a convent and a liberal arts college, and all these different aspects of the community that they were establishing there. And I found this cool postcard from 1906 that shows what they were calling Nazareth Academy at that time, which shows the kind of the mother house and the college itself. But what I'd like to draw your attention to is in the background of that, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but in the background of that postcard, you see this tree line, and then it kind of falls away, and then you see a nice like crest of a hill in the background. And that is literally looking at that southern boundary and back in that map there. And so right where kind of the edge of this perspective drops off, that's kind of where our story takes place. And this place was owned and tended by the sisters for a long time. Eventually, they felt like they didn't have the capacity to do that and approached us about becoming the new stewards of it, and we gladly accepted. There were some huge, like I mentioned, huge potential being in the city limits and close to an urban area. But huge hurdles in terms of the property as well. So most of the uplands look something like this. All of you are wise to many of these species. So honeysuckle, autumn olive, buckthorn, most of the uplands look like this. And Randy can attest to that. We were kind of experiencing this place, working on this project together. And then many of the wetlands look like this. So this is a shot from the early 2000s, I believe. And this is a kind of average section of the wetland at that time. And there's a hybrid cattail there. So you have a native broadleaf cattail and a non-native narrowleaf cattail. And they're both present out here, and they basically mix their genetics up. And the hybrid has sort of a functionally different density and effect on the ecosystem in terms of biodiversity and function. So can really kind of reduce, you can see it's kind of all looks the same. So it has some challenges basically from upland to wetland out here. And like a good steward or a good land management, agency, organization, we want a vision, right? We want to know where we're going. What is our goal with this place? And so my predecessor and mentor, Nate, and probably Randy, developed this map here of Bow in the Clouds, essentially outlining different areas for different plant communities, sort of roughly based on the plant communities we know were around historically. So you can see there's some sort of open parkland up here where the homesteading was. We've got a south-facing slope, some more sun exposure, so we've designated that as oak savanna, oak woodland on the north-facing exposure, and then this wetland area, we're going for kind of a southern wet meadow with these shrub islands to provide some structure, some habitat structure, some benefits for resident and migrating birds, in addition to all the other critters. So we kind of set out that vision, and then we went to work. And I won't, because the SWMLC and all these folks, they're who you want to be talking to and asking for resources for technical invasive species management. I'll be kind of talking about the process in general and kind of what we were finding. So we did a lot of these community work days. So this is Martin Luther King Day, and we actually just had a Martin Luther King work day. We had about 40 people out on the preserve. Really great for people to get out in this kind of spirit of community service and working together, cutting buckthorn and these plants in the uplands. And then we use a little bit of triclopyr herbicide to make sure things don't resprout. And also bringing the essential disturbances back to the landscape. We know that, Potawatomi were the fire keepers, and this landscape was burned, very frequently. And as that has kind of stopped, a lot of the habitat has gotten stale, so to speak, and really has kind of changed from how it was historically. So this is kind of an essential disturbance in our view. And so really exciting, bringing fire back to the wetlands. Believe it or not, wetlands can burn. And in addition, we were starting to peel back all these thick layers of buckthorn and actually sort of revealing things, sorry for the jump in there, revealing things that we didn't appreciate were actually there. So if you reference the map on the left, there's this little pink oval, and that's the area that you see in that lower right picture that we're working, called the Swan Pond. And this was a pond that the sisters had dug in the 60s and had kind of been forgotten about because after that disturbance, of course, that's what invasive species like. And the buckthorn just took it over, and from the trail, you're only 10 yards or less away, and you couldn't even see it. And so in the winter of 2018-19, our Wednesday Warrior group, we actually, our volunteers go out twice a week now, and then once a month we have Saturday work days. So come join us anytime. In the winter of 2018-19, spent 170 hours just taking this on as their mission and clearing out around this buckthorn choked pond. And you can see in the lower left, we had a great March kind of send off to this project where we burned down the brush piles, working with the local fire department, returning some of those mineral nutrients back into the soil. And so as we're kind of in this process of, peeling back this curtain of invasive species, we're finding some incredible things about this preserve. And the mighty oak, I believe, was the name that Randy came up with. And he's the handsome guy to my right in that picture in the upper right. I was just getting started at the crew at that time. But, this tree, you could have been 10, 15 yards away from it and not even appreciate it was there. And it's certainly, probably 150 years old. it's kind of rotting on the inside, but nobody told it to stop growing, and it's doing just fine. So it had this kind of emerging, beautiful savanna landscape, and now it's one of the first things you notice when you go there. Down into some of the wetland sections, we have this beautiful Spring Valley creek there that's doing what a waterway should. It's not ditched and channelized. It's got these beautiful gravel bottom and sand deposit areas, and it's moving back and forth in that beautiful S shape that we really appreciate about rivers. So the waterways are really have these remarkable features. And then this is a drone perspective of that Swan Pond that I mentioned earlier. And so you can see it's kind of got this artificial shape because it was artificially, enhanced or dug. And when we were clearing the buckthorn out around this area, we had many experiences where you clear invasive species and you get more invasive species. And over time, we've really learned to try to avoid that and try to be prepared with a native seed mix that was appropriate for that area, so that we could sort of dictate that next part of the process rather than just whatever was in the seed bank, which often can be invasive, to come up and take over. But what's really cool is that we put the seed mix down after we cleared out all this area, and the seeds didn't even have a chance to germinate because already, late in that spring, we had an explosion of native plants and was not long enough for it to have resulted from any of our seeds. So we're getting bone set and rough-leafed goldenrod, Solidago patula, and Impatiens capensis, spotted jewelweed, great blue lobelia. And these are plants we think of as being, maybe one foot high, 16, 18 inches high. They were loving all the light and all the nutrients from all those fires. It was like shoulder height wildflowers. It was actually really difficult to walk through. So really the landscape was responding for us. We kind of thought we knew what was best and tried to be prepared for it. And just seeing this incredible display of resilience in this habitat. And the piece that kind of capped it all off for me was the section of the wetland that I mentioned. We had the hybrid cattail issue. This is that photo from the initial slide referencing again. And we had worked with the local nature center, the Kalamazoo Nature Center, on a cattail control program. And so they had been out for a couple of seasons managing the cattail with a wetland safe glyphosate. And I was visiting the preserve to kind of assess how the treatments were going. And it sort of peeked out from that shrub wall, and this is what I saw. And I just got chills. It was one of the coolest moments of my career to be able to see this. And I like to say it was a full body experience because, as you can see, you can just visually see pink, all the way to the tree line. This is, of course, Joe Pye weed that we started out with, all the way to the tree line. And I could hear the landscape being restored because there were bumblebees and honeybees and native bees and all sorts of things buzzing around, and I could feel it too. It was kind of muggy, hot August, and so you could sort of really feel the vibration out in the air. So being the bug dork that I am, I was like, I gotta see what this feels like. And so walk out in the middle of this area and just like feel the humming around you. It's just energy coming back into that system was just incredible. And so to me, it kind of brought home that in some cases, we can leverage the native seed bank just by giving native plants the space they need to thrive. We often think of these as like battles and this wall that we're coming up against, but sometimes it's just this initial push, and then nature can really help to finish the job for us. Of course, the job's not really ever over. We're always tending these places, and I'll throw in a couple of caveats that the native seed bank tends to be most strong and resilient in wetland soils. Those conditions do a really good job at preserving seeds. And then the other thing was that we didn't just remove invasive species. We tried to, providing these ideal conditions. So with the increased light from removing that buckthorn canopy, we're following up on invasive control. We're bringing fire in and rejuvenating this sort of nutrient cycling and stimulating those seeds in the seed bank. And so it's a whole system of activities that we're doing to sort of create this effect. But it was just a really special moment. And I encourage anybody to go visit. August is when you'll see the fireworks here, the Joe Pye weed, but yeah, visit anytime. So that was our first story. And the second one I'd like to segue into now, the plant in the background with a big crown. That's the plant in question. So any idea what species of plant that is? I like Heidi's comment that the mighty oak is potentially older than the state of Michigan, quote unquote. So just throw out a guess. It's a mature tree in a woodland, some kind of oak. Yep, it is an oak. So I'll Abby's just knocking them out here. You thought she just knew her invasives. That's definitely not the case. So yeah, this is Quirkus Alba. This is a white oak. And the kind of image and the reference I'm making is to white oak as a species, but also this form of white oak. So you can see kind of a contrast. There's this tree in the foreground that you can see has this sort of skinny, straight trunk. It was probably grown in a shady environment where it's racing to the canopy to be the first one to get to that light to hopefully survive to maturity. That oak in the back has all these lateral limbs, and that doesn't really make sense from a tree's perspective if it's shaded. And so you tend to see these old wolf trees, we call them, or they're called, that were, from these formerly open areas. And so that's kind of the segue into the next story. So as the name maybe suggests, this takes place at a preserve of ours, kind of near the Van Buren, Kalamazoo County boundary, called Wolf Tree Nature Trails. Actually didn't have a name, and we had a naming contest, and someone from the public submitted this name, and we loved it, so we went with it. It's almost 70 acres. It was a donation by a nearby resident. Historically, it was a black oak barren, so you don't have to see everything in the key on the left here, but just look at that big orange blob on the west edge of Kalamazoo County towards the east edge of Van Buren there. And that is the largest, historic area of black oak barrens in the state of Michigan. And these are the 1800 vegetation maps developed by the Michigan Natural Features Inventory and the DNR quite a few years ago. Immensely useful for natural areas kind of management, but right in the heart of this area, the preserve sits. So that's kind of some of the historical context. And we found that it had been disturbed in certain areas. We could just tell that it had kind of this history of disturbance. I'll get into that a little bit more. And we had this map and we were kind of operating on that, but we didn't have a lot of other historical information. So I'll say at this time, we're kind of operating on somewhat of a lack of historical info. And if you notice that upper right image changed from the aerial with the leaf on to the topography. And so this location is right on the Kalamazoo Moraine. And Kalamazoo Moraine stretches through, almost every place in our story and goes from Berrien County all the way through Cass. It's actually called the Kasopoulos Ice Contact Ridge. So it's right on this high ridge. So for Southwest Michigan, you can see 950 there. If you're pushing 1,000 feet, you're like getting a nosebleed in Southwest Michigan. So we're up on the moraine here with these droughty soils where these savannas would have developed. So here's kind of that aerial image again. We found as we explored the preserve more, we had this kind of dichotomy where the west half of the preserve had a lot more non-native species. So you can see sweet pea there is kind of like a garden escapee. And, a lot of the area kind of had this, probably familiar to many of you, this like shrub haze where it's just kind of at eye level, topping out around 6-7 feet. There's this variety of honeysuckle and autumn olive and things like that. So it's kind of hard to see, kind of hard to get around. And in particular, the west half of the property had that state. And I know weedy is totally subjective, but I'll just call it more weedy on the west half. On the east half, we certainly had some invasive issues, but we were finding plants that were more conservative. And if you're not familiar with that term conservative as it applies to ecology, essentially it's plants that are tied to the way that things used to be. So think, pre-colonial settlement, the plants that were on the landscape have these variety of habitats, and then those landscape change as we colonize. And so plants that really need high quality habitats that look like the way things used to be, they're highly conservative, and they're usually signs of high quality natural areas too. So we're finding these things like the striped wintergreen in the upper right, and the American Columbo in the lower left, which is just the coolest, top 5 favorite plants. I mean, you should look it up. It's a flowering plant, but only flowers once in its life. It really seems to be love these historical savanna landscapes. And it had more of this open woodland character to it. So it was more conservative side of the property. And so having that survey on the ground data, we developed some different restoration techniques for different parts of the preserve. And we felt a little more justified in using some more heavy-handed techniques on the west, given the level of disturbance. So we partnered with a company called Generation 3, kind of excavating gone restoration, and they were literally pulling up these just massive autumn olive, by hand, so to speak, with an excavator, and just popping the roots out, and nothing more satisfying than seeing that. And then afterwards, knowing that we probably had a very weedy upland seed bank, we bought a commercial seed mix and broadcast it over the kind of open ground from some of these activities. So we used heavy restoration on the west, and then the east half we used more light restoration. So cutting things by hand, even thinning some of the canopy to promote oak regeneration. You're seeing the very top there. And so we had these sort of differences between the two parts of the property. But what we were wondering, we purchased a seed mix for the west part because it seemed like it was so disturbed. We're not seeing many native species there. We wanted to know if we could rely on the seed bank as we move forward with restoration on the east half. And yeah, we knew in the west half we weren't going to expect that. And so set up a small kind of experiment and outline these two areas on the east half and just comparing the two. And each one of those little white spots that you see there, I went and collected seeds from the seed bank. And you might be asking, how do you do that? It's actually pretty amazing and pretty simple. You just take your kind of standard soil core, and most of the seeds from the plants that are just raining down on the soil all the time tend to be stored in that top 10 centimeters of soil. So pulled 10 centimeters of soil from each of those places, partnered with a native plant producer, Chad Hewson at Hidden Savannah, very appropriately named, very close to this preserve. And he helped rear essentially the seeds out in a greenhouse setting. And so we just broadcast the seed mix over a sterilized potting medium to see what was underground, basically, what was the seed mix, and was it going to be something that we were going to like to see if we start burning and clearing, or something that could be kind of an issue. And we also paired that, we had 3 very talented volunteers who really know their plants, and they did an above ground plant inventory. So basically comparing what's below ground, or what's the potential to get as we start this restoration process, and what's actually growing out there right now. So we thought it'd be interesting to kind of compare those two. And fascinating to me, never sort of ceases to amaze me, that the above ground and below ground plant communities only shared 15% of the species. So in other words, this P1, this unit up here, all the species that germinated from the seed bank, they were not found growing actively on the site. And there were a few in this other one, but essentially the below ground community was completely different than the above ground community. And so next question you're probably wondering is, well, what were those species? And so here's kind of a scatter shot of some of those species. And starting from the kind of upper left, I'll do a counterclockwise. So I've got water horehound in the upper left, soft stem rush, staghorn sumac, spotted St. John's wort, black raspberry, mullein, slender sand sedge, and rough-rooted cinquefoil. And I won't go into the details on every one of these species, But if you start looking at the kind of habitats they prefer, and again, these are the ones from the seed bank, overall, it just suggests that where we collected them used to be more wet, more sunny, and more disturbed, just because of the way that these plants are affiliated with places that have those conditions. And so just really got us kind of scratching our head about what was going on out there, because there wasn't, you know, a lick of surface water or wetland vegetation on the property at all. And so it was just kind of curious. And so we started looking a little bit more into the aerials, the historic aerials. And this is sort of a modern look. You can see that kind of open area on the west where we did that heavy-handed restoration, the more closed canopy on the east. And I'd like to direct your attention, yeah, so this is 98, 2018. So direct your attention to that kind of northeast quadrant where you see that depression, that big kettle that I showed on the topographic map earlier. And so going from 98 to 2018, there's this area here outlined in blue, and this kettle had never shown a lick of surface water in it. And we had a series of really, really heavy spring rains, which are kind of predicted to increase in our area. And all of a sudden we had this permanent water feature on the property. And this is kind of a view from the edge of the trail, edge of the boundary there. Takes up a good couple of acres and hasn't gone dry since. And so, so it's really kind of a cool feature, and starting to kind of say, okay, maybe some of these wetland plants, you know, make sense. If they're throughout time, as rain levels change, there might have been wetlands in this area. And then I saw the light of the 1938 aerial images, which is this great data set I encourage everybody to look at in their particular area they're interested in or stewarding. And those areas where I sampled the seed bank are kind of outlined there in orange. And you can see just how amazingly different they look. If you go out there now, it's like a forested woodland. It's hard to imagine, but you know, 80 years ago, we were basically farming wall to wall in our landscape. And so kind of a quick walk through these images. These really pale areas are soil reflecting back up at the aerial photograph. So these are probably areas that are being actively tilled or cleared. The light gray areas were probably grass, so being pastured or kind of cleared and abandoned. And then these gridded areas are orchards, maybe apple trees or other fruit trees. And then the dark colored shapes are, you know, kind of mature deciduous trees. And so you can see there really wasn't much of you know, a forested natural community visible out here at that time. And just amazing how different the landscape looked. And right about that time, we had connected with a family that owned it before the gentleman that donated it to us. And that gentleman owned it for about 40 years. So these images are probably in 1940s. And so we're right up there at the northern boundary. So, I mean, you just see how far you can see. And if you go out there today, it's unbelievable to think how much the landscape has changed. And directing your attention back over to the east side of the property, we're getting those clusters of trees, which are probably there to kind of reforest things once farming was abandoned on site. That pink spot right there, you can see the crown of an individual tree, and that's right where today we have our wolf tree. And so then it just clicked for me, and it all kind of came full circle. And it's like, you know, now when I see a tree like this, I immediately start thinking about history. And so really just kind of brought home to me that history really informs our management, our stewardship, and kind of drives the outcomes that we can see. And if you're interested in exploring this more, the 1938 aerials are as eye-opening as anything for your particular area you're interested in. Those 1800 vegetation maps are really great. You can actually dig up the old surveyor notes, and someone can probably correct me in the chat, but I believe a lot of these are available at your local conservation district. You can go in and look at them that way. And also never underestimate the power of verbal, you know, just talking with landowners who have been in this area and have seen some of these changes. The seed bank is literal history. So, I mean, those seeds are there because some plant was there historically that dropped its seed in. didn't have the right conditions to germinate, and now it's being stored. And so that's another way to kind of assess the history of a site. And of course, now, that I sort of seen this whole sequence take place, now I'm, getting better at reading the landscape. And I think just over time, that's something that we gain. So knowing that this tree means that this area was much more open historically. And then if you're get into the kind of literature, in terms of the scientific literature, they use this term land use legacies, which essentially mean the way that a property was treated historically can kind of set it on this trajectory that's only so flexible. So really the past land use dictates a lot of the outcomes that you can find there. So cool. So that's story number 2. And then our last story, gonna go through here. This is our mystery plant. Nancy says we have old aerials in our office at Berrien Conservation District. Excellent. So yeah, go talk to Nancy if you're in Berrien County and take a look at those. Anybody have a guess as to what this pretty yellow flower is? It's a head scratcher. Come on, Abby, 3 for 3. Tulip tree, good guess. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. It's got that exactly that kind of tulip symmetrical shape and the pollen in the middle like that. There we go. Yep, Jen got it. Good guesses. Yep, water lily. Yeah, so this is spatterdock, Nufar advena, or yellow pond lily, aka spatterdock. So of course, they didn't give you the context, which probably would have helped a lot, but this is usually the setting that you see this plant growing in. So this will kind of segue into our last story. And as you might guess, this one is kind of surrounding the issue of water or hydrology. And a little foreshadowing there, this story takes place at a place called Hidden Pond. So this is that, again, that northern extent of that Kasopoulos ice contact ridge that goes down right through the heart of the Southwest by Southwest area. And a really oak-driven landscape. So this was another donation around 2008. And all those various colors around that star are different types of oak communities, oak barrens, oak hickory forests, mixed oak hardwoods. And so that's really kind of the prevailing driver and cornerstone of this ecosystem. And this particular project was driven by a donor and a partner who was seeing it was during the housing boom, and seeing this area, 60-acre old farm. The farmer decided, it was time to kind of move on and retire the farm and had it up for sale. And it was essentially being scoped out for a housing development. And this is right in the middle of Berry State Game Area. So this is one of our largest pieces of public land in southern Michigan. And so just, would have become basically a bedroom housing community potentially for Grand Rapids or Kalamazoo. And so really didn't want to see that. So I actually purchased the property and donated it to us. And it's in that little red pocket there. So kind of filling in these inholdings in this public conservation area. And we essentially got it in the form of a tired old farm. And so now we know the importance of the 1938s. This one actually came from the Berry Conservation District. So there you go. And you can see, looking at those different colors that we looked at in the last story, pretty much everything here is being tilled or is being grazed. And you can see there's some waterways kind of going through here and sort of these artificially straight lines. And so, of course, we didn't get it in 1938. But if you fast forward to 1999, a little bit more of a modern era, you can sort of see some of those patterns are holding. There's some more structures on the property, but you can see the surrounding landscape is a lot more forested. So you can see the things are changing a little bit, and then, kind of keep an eye on this little circle down here in the lower central part of the property boundary. Was this wet spot that the farmer could never quite get dry enough to cultivate. And, we've got buildings out here to deal with. So we have literal structures, these waterways. Here's some shots of those waterways. They're ditched and channelized. And there's that wet spot that we spoke about. So when this was being actively cultivated, that's essentially what this spot looked like. So you can see all the corn stubble, just this kind of wet, muddy depression that they never planted. So we've got structural issues, we've got damaged soils from over a century of tillage and, kind of intensive agriculture, and we've got altered hydrology. So from top to bottom, we've got an ecosystem that really needs some love, and basically from bottom to top needs some restoration. So I won't go into great detail, but those a lot of those open fields we converted into prairie and savanna plantings. A lot of great resources on how to do this. I'm just kind of showing the visual evolution of it. So that was going along really well. We partnered with the company Native Connections to do the seed and the drilling, starting to burn this area, seeing all these pollinator communities come back. You've got sand coreopsis and lupin here in the lower left, and rough blazing star. So things are really coming together there. And this was really cool. The donor actually offered to plant a field that the DNR owned at the same time. And this is a mass bloom of Rudbeckia hirta. So if you've ever seen one of these plantings, you know that some plants come in stronger first. And this was Rudbeckia hirta. So it's a short-lived perennial, bright yellow coneflower, and just incredible to see the scale that some of this is happening on. So that's about, I think, a 13-acre planting. So stabilizing the soils, things are kind of coming together there. We had taken apart those buildings and transported them off-site. But then this kind of tricky question we've been dancing around, how do you fix hydrology? And in my mind, it's harder to fix and kind of harder to understand because you can't necessarily see it. So that's kind of what I'll be talking about here. And our general just thought was, well, with hydrology issues, you think about culverts and dams, think about these barriers. So how can we remove barriers and restore kind of a historic natural flow? And so surface water is fairly easy to understand. It goes from uphill to downhill, upstream to downstream. Two tributaries come together, make a larger tributary, and on down. We could kind of get a visual on that, but groundwater is a little bit more difficult to understand because you can't see everything that's going on underground. But in general, it's going to flow, perpendicular to these topographic lines, which is just downhill. And so this would be kind of the general pattern of groundwater, any rain that essentially fell in this area and moved through this preserve. And so it's that wet depression in the lower kind of central part here. You can see this little saddle or this low point where these topographic lines don't quite connect and make it a bowl and kind of create this overflow setting. And so we talked to the old farmer, again, using that verbal history to understand the place. And he said, oh yeah, that's either my grandfather or great grandfather dug by hand, down 10 feet and put down these clay tiles. And if you're not familiar with tiles, they're just basically tubes designed to move water off-site quickly and drain things and make them easier to farm. He knew exactly where those tiles were. And we essentially dug them up with large equipment and we broke them and disabled them. So breaking tiles slows the water down and creates more of the natural percolation through the soil and can result in an expression of surface water sometimes. And indeed, from 1999, you can see that aerial again, 2010, I'll do that again, kind of look at that wet area. And within a matter of months, the whole thing filled with surface water. So we didn't pipe anything into it. This was just purely from the surrounding landscape. And you can kind of see some of the before and after there. And again, with that wetland seed bank, Nate Fuller, my predecessor, said, let's put seed in the uplands that we know have been farmed and rely on that wetland seed bank for the lowland areas. And so you can see our friend Spatterdock there coming in on its own, whether it came in on duck feet or was in the seed bank, caked in that clay for 150 years is beyond me. But came in and biodiversity was returning. And so, you know, outside of the plants, we're finding thousands of tadpoles the very next spring, you know, after these tiles were broken. Lots of frogs, invertebrates like damselflies and dragonflies, the occasional grumpy old snapping turtle in there, wood ducks, sandhill cranes, and just incredible. All the wildlife is acting like this thing has been here the whole time, when for 150 years, it's been just a wet, muddy spot. So just a real privilege to kind of observe this. And one really, really cool component of that I'll play this video here for. I was out here on a June day when we were doing some more restoration, and those dark things you can see flying around are dragonflies. And I've never seen so many dragonflies in one spot. They're like bumping into the camera and bumping into each other. And so I was trying to figure out what's going on here. And I determined that one of the species, at least, was this beautiful blue big dragonfly called a spatterdock darner. Don't know how to pronounce that, so I'm not going to try, but spatterdock darner is the common name. And when you look up information about them, it says they like big ponded areas that have spatterdock and water lilies. And that was exactly what we had created. So just to see the hydrology fuel the plant life, and to see the hydrology fuel the animal life, you know, water is life, as they like to say, and just really brought home that this hydrology is so foundational to this ecosystem health. You know, creating more water on site literally brought new plant species to the site that weren't there before. And so, you know, increased plant richness is allowing this natural hydrology to cleanse the groundwater, restoring function, and of course, restoring that biodiversity that we saw. And with that, I'll end. That's the last story. And I really like this idea that restoration is not a spectator sport. So I'm preaching to the choir here, but from the level of your yard to a state game area and everything in between, you know, get involved. Go visit some of these places. They're completely free. They're open all year, and consider becoming a member and supporting our work. And we have all the social media stuff. We have a YouTube channel, and if anybody has any questions, they can email me at this address, which I can also pop into the chat if needed. Yeah, Alex, with that, I think I'm out of stories, out of time.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to share that with us. We've got about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions.
How about we just say that was awesome?
Yeah.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. I don't know where that came from, but thank you. Yeah, and I just also say that, you know, I'm the one presenting it, but just know that there are thousands of volunteer hours and grant dollars and partnerships and everything that fueled this whole thing. So I just am the lucky one who gets to talk about it, but it takes a community, it takes a village.
Well, while we're waiting for some questions to roll in, I just want to say that right when I think that my job is the best, Mitch starts talking, and then I think his job is nothing but cool. I wanted to ask that when you were talking about, you know, when you start a site project, you map it out and you're looking at like what do we want to see? What are the goals for this site? What sort of plant habitats do we want to see? When you're doing that, what's the time scale you're looking at? Are you thinking like the next 100 years we're going to set this up, or in the next 20 years we want to see this? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of 5-year goals because the future is just so hard to predict, but 5 years seems like we have a reasonable idea of like things that are going to happen. So I think like the mapping of those plant communities, that's kind of a general vision, a general, you know, like the bumpers in your bowling lane, like it's kind of keeping you within a certain set of parameters, and then kind of making 5-year goals and moving towards that. And then kind of, you know, call it adaptive management. Is just a fancy way of saying we don't know what's going to happen. So we try to make some positive progress and then kind of see how things go, make sure we're monitoring and assessing, and then, you know, kind of change course, change correction if need be. And then we go back as far as we can. I mean, obviously the climate of 500 years ago is not the climate of today. So we're thinking about those kinds of things as well. But yeah, so kind of try to set up a long-term vision and then, you know, move it along in chunks and adjust as needed, I guess.
Cool.
Yeah, so Corey, great question. Yeah, between our work, you know, having a crew, and I know Christy's on here with the Wednesday Warriors, we've had just a number of sites where it feels so satisfying to go in and whack down the buckthorn and kind of vilify those invasive species that we know how to take care of. And in particular, I think we've found that, so if folks haven't seen, Corey said, yeah, elaborate on what you mean when you remove invasives and other invasives come in. Had a number of experiences where we kind of vilify the shrubs and whack them down and take them out and then pat ourselves on the back and go home and drink a beer. And then what happens is we get, you know, all these weedy kind of herbaceous species coming up from that seed bank. Part of the reason we're exploring that seed bank issue, and that's kind of spurred this separate track of volunteerism that we have of collecting native seeds and kind of distributing them in places like that. And the challenge is that you don't know what's in the seed bank. And so I think that really dictates kind of what is going to come in, but you have to think about what are the plants that have been living there for the last, you know, 50 years. Those are going to be the seeds that have been falling and falling and falling. And so when you bring in light and you take away competition, it's going to stimulate whatever is in the ground. And so we try to do a better job at predicting that. If you know an area is heavily disturbed, like it's been tilled, it's been, you know, very altered, then chances are you're probably not going to get a strong native seed bank, and you might want to think about, you know, introducing seed, but taking time to kind of assess that is important too. So yeah, one example would be like you cut down the buckthorn and you make more room for the garlic mustard or something.
Yeah, something we're always trying to avoid.
Yep.
That
and we've kind of explored at that Bow in the Clouds in particular. It's such a heavily disturbed site that basically from top to bottom in these forested areas, you know, everything is non-native. So some of the canopy in those areas are black locust. But if we were to cut down all the black locust and cut down all the Siberian elms, cut down all the European buckthorn, we would have a barrens, like it would be completely open and we wouldn't have anything left. So it's kind of puts this interesting perspective of, you know, can we work with some of these non-native species, or how do you tackle that? So don't have good answers. That's the fun part.
always learning.
Yep.
I think those the soil test you did was really cool. I'm interested, when you were doing that, did you end up finding the plants that were there, the ones that you were seeing above the ground?
So we didn't really. So it was only like 15%, just as far as like the number of species we found. You know, there are only a handful that we actually, that the surveyors actually found like actively growing out there. So the seed bank was kind of a novel plant community that we didn't know was there. And I would encourage, I think it's something that, you know, contractors could do and nurseries could do too, of someone could, you know, think about sending a soil sample into your farm service agency or MSU to give you analysis of what's going on there. I think that would be a really cool thing to kind of collect soil from different areas on a property and send it in to sort of get a seed bank signature. People have been doing that in the research world for a long time, but we don't really do it, you know, kind of on the ground. And it's pretty easy. You just grab some dirt, just get the right kind of depth and maybe record where it came from. And give it some nice conditions, and then you'll kind of potentially see what pops out.
That is really cool,
Yeah.
especially for those agricultural lands. You know, I typically look at those and say, oh man, that could have been something. Who knows what that was 100 to 200 to 200 plus years ago. But you pulled some really cool stuff from those agricultural lands.
Yeah, I was hoping that there'd be some, you know, magnificent wildflowers or something like that. I mean, they were a lot of them were annuals, and a lot of them were like graminoids, so like sedges and grasses and things like that, or weedy species that are really good at moving around the landscape. So, you know, it kind of makes sense because those species rely on seed really, really heavily. And so, yeah, not all species have the ability to seed bank equally, but.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a very exciting, it sounds like a very exciting field, but also a very humbling field at the same time.
Yeah, anybody can do it.
Very cool. We have a few more minutes for questions. If anybody wants to either put them in the chat, or feel free to turn on your video or your microphone. We'd be happy to chat.
Yeah, Heidi said we got to connect on big old trees and pick sometime. Absolutely.
So that restoration is not a spectator sport. That's not like copyrighted or anything, right?
No, feel free to slap it on your bumper, whatever t-shirts, like whatever you want to do with it. There are no original ideas anymore, so, you know, I'm sure someone else said it before me.
Got a question from Carrie Giffen. Do you know of any resources or information sources for people trying to evaluate and develop a plan for long-term stewardship of their land?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think from kind of a private landowner perspective, there are a lot of consultants out there that are great at this. You know, depending on the you know, if it's something that you could pay someone to do, or are looking for kind of a template to do it yourself, might dictate the options. But we work with, if we have funding, we work with someone to go in and do like a botanical inventory and kind of walk the property and find out kind of what the general habitat groupings are. You know, this area is maybe kind of oak hickory, this area is kind of beech maple, this is kind of this shrub car wetland. And then there's lots of information at Michigan Natural Features Inventory and other sources about kind of what characterizes those habitats and maybe how you should manage them. So I think that's kind of the first step, is knowing what you have. And if you look at there's a ton of different management plan templates. Essentially, it would just be like a Word file where you would kind of fill in. So if it's something you were going to do on your own, you know, you could find somebody who's, if you're a botanist or you know somebody who's a botanist, that'd be kind of the first step of understanding what you have. And then, you know, for better or for worse, the other really important factor is, what are your resources, you know, financial, you know, do you have a tractor? Do you have money to pay for a burn? Can you partner with a SWMLC to help you with, you know, invasive plant management or understanding, those sorts of things. So I think kind of understanding is the first important part. And then what resources do you have? What are your goals? What do you want to see? And I would just suggest looking for management plan templates to start to kind of fill those in. I don't know if that answered your question or not. It's a hard question to answer.
Yeah. You can also always reach out to your county's conservation district. They have a lot of great resources to help with that.
And they're hiring.
And we're hiring.
Yeah.
Yeah, notice what Corey said. They're looking for a new district administrator.
Yeah, 100%. Dave, right on, Dave. So many projects where we're like so excited to go in and do a burn or do invasive species work. And we're like, you took a picture before we did that, right? And shaking our head. Yes, take pictures before, after, during, on Tuesdays, like all the time.
Take
such an
pictures
easy way to
before it's
document.
on fire.
Yes.
Well, folks, I just put my email as well as Alex's. Mitch, if you want to throw yours in the chat in case people want to get a hold of you.
Yeah.
Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Mitch, for that great talk. It was really eye-opening. We're looking to another year doing good work with the SWMLC, and we'll see you next year.
Yeah.
If
Thank
not
you
beforehand.
all.
We'll see you
Great to see you.
beforehand.
Hi, everybody.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.
See ya.
Take care.
Yeah.